The focus of this lecture is on the land of Canada, what it's like, the resources and such. To start with, Canada is a very, very big country. It's actually the second biggest country in land area in the entire world. Number one is Russia, number three is the United States. But one of the things to know about Canada is even though it's so massive, it's way bigger than the United States, it's very, very large. There are only 2 people that live per square mile. And you remember, our average in the United States is 70 people per square mile. So some places there's, almost 1,000 people per square mile, and then only really in Alaska is it as low as Canada has. Okay, why though? Why is there not very many people that live there? Well, a lot of it has to do with their location and how far north they are. If you go up there in latitude and you get those higher numbers of latitude further away from the equator, it's going to be cold. And the fact that it is cold most of the year round makes it really hard to live there because you can't grow crops. Things grow very slowly. And it's just a difficult place to live, and it's mostly due to that weather. So most of the people in Canada are bunched right up really, really close to the U.S. border. I think the statistic is that, a very high percentage of people live within 90 miles of the U.S. border that live in Canada. Your next task on your notes is to label all of the provinces of Canada. There are 13 different provinces of Canada, and I think this map does a really good job of it because it made them all different colors, and so it's kind of easy to tell which one is which, but you need to label them on yours. I'll talk about just a couple of the tricky ones because all the big ones are really easy, but over on this right side, it gets kind of tricky. And so these 2 pieces of land are connected, and they're called Newfoundland and Labrador. And so that is one province together, even though it's called Newfoundland and Labrador. Nova Scotia is down here, and Nova Scotia includes both of these red islands. They're actually connected, but they almost look like separate islands. One of them looks like a high heel shoe turned on its side, and then that little piece behind it as well. Because a lot of people will say that this island they think is Prince Edward Island, but it's not. Prince Edward Island is this tiny, tiny, tiny little island. I'll draw a line in there pointing to it. Okay, this island right there, that tiny little island stuck in there. Okay, and then New Brunswick is on its own in that pink color. So hopefully you can see all those. If you can't, ask about them in class. On the next map, we need to label the 6 regions, physical regions of Canada, so that we can kind of explain what each of them are and so that you know where they are on a map. And the first region of Canada that we'll talk about is the Canadian Cordillera. Okay, and the Canadian Cordillera I will put in purple, but the Canadian Cordillera is just an extension of the Rocky Mountains. It's the same exact mountains. It's just once they cross into Canada, they're called the Canadian Cordillera. So they're on the same side, and they actually go all the way up to the ocean. So the mountains, these purple mountains, are that Canadian Cordillera. So you're going to build those in. Remember, I said it went all the way up to Alaska, and so it kind of runs all through this region, so make sure you draw those in there. And then the next area that we'll talk about is the Arctic archipelago, and I can do that. I'll circle that in blue. And an archipelago is simply a chain of islands, okay? And so this big chain of islands way up north in the Arctic Circle is known as the Arctic archipelago. And so all of these islands is the Arctic archipelago, okay? The next one, which I will do in green, I'll circle in green, is the interior plains. And the interior plains is kind of the next step in from the Canadian Cordillera, okay? And it is right in here. And that is an extension of something in America too. That's an extension of the Great Plains. And so this is an area where a lot of grains and farming can be done, with corn and wheat and barley and oats and that kind of thing. Okay, the next region, which I'll do in red, is the largest region. Okay, it is called the Canadian Shield. And so the Canadian Shield actually encompasses all of this, okay, and then it also goes down and all the way out here. Okay, so it's a very, very big area. Okay, and so all the way through here, this right here is actually water. That's the Hudson Bay. Okay, but all around that water, it is a huge, huge area of rock called the Canadian Shield. Now, the next one we'll go ahead and do in yellow, and this is the smallest region, okay? It's the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway lowlands, okay? And that runs kind of all the way through this area, okay? And so that would be the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway lowlands. And last but not least, we'll do them in orange, is the Atlantic provinces. Those are these provinces over on this side that touch the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, and so we'll talk about each of these physical regions, but now you should have an idea of where they belong on the map. Okay, so like I said, the Canadian Cordillera, the picture is right here on top, okay, is an extension of the Rocky Mountains. So it's very, very similar to the Rocky Mountains, and they go all along the Pacific coast of Alaska, or sorry, of Canada. All right, and so it's this extension of the Rocky Mountains, feels a lot like it, and of course, being mountains and being new and building itself up, it is the youngest physical region of the entire area. Now, while it's still millions of years old, it's much younger than the Canadian Shield, much younger than the Interior Plains, younger than any of these areas, okay? Because, you know, those mountains are still being formed. They're still being made today. The Interior Plains is the next one, and again, it's this extension of the U.S. Great Plains. Okay, it's very similar to like North Dakota, South Dakota, parts of western Minnesota and southern Minnesota. Okay, parts of Montana. It's this big open flat land that's used for farming. Okay, the Arctic archipelago, which this picture right here is of the pieces of the Arctic archipelago, is a chain of islands. It's in the northernmost region, and so it's mostly covered in ice and snow almost all year long. And so really you don't see very many people living there, and if they are, they're nomadic, they're Inuits. So we'll talk about them later on as we continue through our information about Canada. The Canadian Shield, like I said, is huge. It's enormous. It's by far the biggest region of Canada. It is this huge rocky area, and so it was rocks that were built up through however many years, millions of years, and the glaciers came through and dug out big areas within them, and those areas filled up with water and they became lakes. And so it's this giant rocky area dotted with tons and tons of lakes. It feels a lot like the Duluth area if you've been up there, these rock shores on these really big lakes that were dug out by the glaciers when they receded back to the north. And so it is about 2.8 million square miles. So 1 square mile is 1 mile by 1 mile, and you got to think 2.8 million of those is how big this Canadian Shield is. And like I said, by far the largest region of all of them. The other two physical regions have something in common. They have a moderate climate, so a climate that's not too bad. They're pretty close to the U.S., so it's kind of like Minnesota's climate, really. Okay, and fertile soil, so good area for growing crops, and just living, for growing things to be able to eat. And so, of course, those two things put together means this is where the really, really big populations are. So like I said, most of the people live in these physical regions, and most of these physical regions are within 90 miles of the United States border. And so very, very close to the United States. The Atlantic provinces is one of them, and that is an area that is a lot of the kind of Appalachian mountain type things. So you can see there are some of these rock cliffs and stuff from the mountains, but they're really worn down rock with trees and grasses and things like that on the very, very old mountains, as opposed to the ones in the west, the Cordilleras. And so the good thing about the Atlantic provinces is they all have access to the Atlantic Ocean, so they all have a great opportunity to trade with any of the countries of Europe. The last one is the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway, and while it's the smallest region by a long ways, tiny area right around the lakes, Lake Superior, and this big river that goes out to the ocean, the St. Lawrence Seaway, even though it's tiny, 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 it is where most people live in Canada. Look back at your map. That tiny little region is where most people live in Canada. So as we look at the climate of Canada, we need to remember climate has all of these things in mind. It has temperature, elevation, meaning how high up in the air you are, the wind patterns, as well as precipitation, the rain, snow, sleet, any water falling out of the sky in whatever form. Okay, and so the biggest influence on the climate of Canada is that it's further north. It's very far north. And so because of its latitude, because of how far up it is, how far away from the sun's direct rays, the equator, okay, it is much colder. It's a much colder country. And so really within this, there are two major broad areas of climate. There are ocean climates in Canada, and these ocean climates happen right along the sides, okay, of Canada, the Atlantic and the Pacific side, and these ocean climates are usually moderated because those water bodies, their temperatures do not go up as fast or down as fast as land pieces. And so if it's really, really cold outside, the land gets cold really fast, but the water takes a long time to get cold, and so it'll keep the air warmer, okay, and vice versa if it's really, really warm outside. So it keeps them kind of at a nicer temperature than the other areas. The continental climates, they get really extreme because the land can heat up really fast and it can cool down really fast. And so it gets much warmer in the continental climates when it's time to be warm, and much colder when it's the time of year for it to be cold. So the more specific climates that we see in Canada are these. We see a lot of, especially where most of the people live, a lot of continental cool summer climates, which is what Minnesota is. Okay, a continental cool summer is the areas really, really close to the U.S. border, so most of the people live in them. And there can be a pretty large variance in temperature. It doesn't get super, super hot in the summer, but it definitely can get hot and humid. And in the winter, it can get very, very cold. So there can be a difference of 120, 130 degrees from the highest temperature in Canada that's shown and the lowest. Okay, and so there's this very, very big change in temperature variance. The next ones that you'll see are subarctic and tundra climates, and I'm kind of putting them together, but tundra is much colder than subarctic. Okay, it's the next step colder, but both of them have extremely long, extremely cold winters. You don't see summer for very often, and when there is summer, the highest it gets, like best case scenario, it gets up to maybe 50 degrees. And so for this short period of time and 50 degrees, you don't see very many plants, okay? And so the only things that can really survive are like moss and shrubs and very, very low growing items, okay? And so in subarctic and tundra climates, you just don't see very much growing, and so not very many people live there, because how do you survive if nothing will grow? It's very difficult. Okay, and the last one is maritime climates. Those are those ocean climates that we talked about. And again, they're very rainy, like you think of Seattle or like you think of England, and they don't change very much from season to season. The temperature never gets super, super hot, never gets super, super cold. And the maritime climates are mostly on the west coast of Canada. So one type of orographic precipitation that does happen often on the west coast of Canada, where those oceanic or maritime climates are, is orographic precipitation. And what happens with orographic precipitation is it's rain that's caused by the ocean air coming in off of the ocean and hitting the mountains. And so what happens is this warm air, and you can see it in this graphic below, hopefully you're paying attention to it, but this warm air that's wet because it's so dense with water, because it's right over the water, picks up water and it stays warm and it moves in off the coast. Okay, and so as that warm, moist air, that warm, moist wind starts to come up, it starts to get colder, because as you go up into the air further away from the earth, it gets colder and colder and colder. And so as it hits the mountains, it has to go up and it has to start rising. Well, as it gets cold, it starts to condense. The water in there starts to become water instead of water vapor. Okay, and so it can't be carried by the air anymore. And so the air keeps moving, but all of the water gets dropped down out of it, okay, and it rains down onto this side of the mountain, onto the west side of the mountain, because that's where, if this is west and this is east, that's where it's coming from, okay. And so the rain comes down, and if the winds always come from the west like they do in North America, then that west side of the mountain is always going to see lots of rain, because that warm, moist wind comes in and it condenses as it goes up the mountain. And that a lot of that rain doesn't make it over the mountain because it all kind of drops out of that air. And then the air keeps going, and so on the other side, it's almost always dry because all of that rain has dumped out of that air. Okay, and so the west side, is called the windward side, and it is usually rainy and gets lots and lots of rain, whereas with orographic precipitation, the leeward side gets very little. And so oftentimes you see on the west side of a set of mountains, you'll see a lot of rain in these tropical destinations and these really tons of rain areas, maritime climates. And then on the east side, you might see deserts or extremely dry grasslands or something like that, because the rain just doesn't make it over those mountains because of orographic precipitation. So our next topic, and almost our last topic really, is to talk about the resources that each of our regions has. And so we'll start off with the largest region. We'll start off with the Canadian Shield. And the Canadian Shield, like I said, is so big. It runs all the way from Minnesota. Minnesota has parts of the Canadian Shield in it, all the way up to the Arctic Circle. So it encompasses almost like a big chunk of Canada, almost all of it really. Okay, and like I said, it was created by the glaciers. And so it carved out the lakes and it carved out the land to look like it does today. Okay, and so it built these things like the Great Lakes and like Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls, one of our most famous waterfalls that we have on our continent that a lot of people go and look at. And oftentimes we go from Niagara Falls, New York, and we go and look at these Niagara Falls, even though they technically are part of Canada. Okay, and in this region, in the Canadian Shield, you see lots and lots of minerals and metals. Okay, and some of the minerals that you see are copper, iron, and nickel, which are used all over the places in manufacturing. And so you need those things to build a lot of the materials that we have and use on a daily basis in our world. Basically, anything that's not plastic, anything that is metal, is made using at least one of these three metals. Okay, and then there are also precious metals that you don't see as often, like lead, which is a heavy metal that can be used a lot in industry, as well as gold and silver. Okay, and gold and silver, we know those are valuable. We know that humans like those and have put a big price on them. But all of these resources are vital for both industry all the way around the world. Everybody needs all of these things. In the Arctic archipelago, there are some resources, but mostly they're all covered with ice and snow, so it's constantly covered with ice and snow, except for in the summer, and then it's it's not very much of it is left without being frozen. So most of it, a little bit of it thaws on the top, but then most of the soil stays frozen. And so we can see what that is called permafrost. And we can see this guy up here is standing next to some permafrost. And you can tell that in the summer, this top little layer above here does thaw out and things can grow in that soil. But anything underneath there is still frozen, and it stays frozen year round. So within permafrost, that is soil or dirt that is always frozen. Okay, it is always frozen on these thousands of islands of the Arctic archipelago. Most of it has permafrost or soil that is just constantly frozen. And so really, there's not many resources that we can easily get to there. And really, even if there were something we could get to, there just isn't much up there, period. Okay, and so then we're going to move from one of the regions that has the least to one of the best regions, and that is the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes lowlands. The St. Lawrence and Great Lakes, the reason that most people live there is because of the climate, but also because it has an awesome transportation route. Okay, it has this transportation route where from the Great Lakes you can get to the St. Lawrence Seaway, and then from the St. Lawrence Seaway you can go right out into the Atlantic Ocean, and you can trade with any country that's connected to all the oceans, which is essentially every country. Okay, and so this transportation route has needed to have some canals built to make sure it can easily go from lake to lake and all of this. Okay, so some canals have had to be built as well as some locks, which hopefully you remember is basically a water elevator that brings you up or down. Okay, but the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes lowlands also have fertile soil. So you can grow a lot of food and a lot of products within that small area, and that's why most people live there. The other thing that has a lot of water, and so many dams on the rivers have been put up. And what a dam does, the whole purpose of a dam is for it to stop the river and reroute it through a small area. And the small area that you reroute it through, you put a turbine in there, something that spins. Okay, and so that spinning thing, the water goes through it, and the water makes it spin. And it's spinning through these turbines creates energy that creates electricity. And so hydroelectric power is electricity created by the water running through these turbines that you've moved through that area. Okay, and so all of these things, transportation, fertile soil, hydroelectric power, they allow this area, the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes area, to be the center of population, the center of industry, the center of cities in Canada. Right, the resources that we see in the Atlantic provinces are many. They're much like the northeast part of the United States, like Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont and all of these areas. Okay, and there's a lot of fishing. Okay, and fishing, it's probably the best fishing in the entire world is right off the coast of these Atlantic provinces, and Americans and Canadians fight about who gets to fish there all the time. And it's in an area called the mixing zone. And the mixing zone is where from the south warm ocean currents come in, and then from the north cold ocean currents come in, and those warm and cold ocean currents mix up. And so you can have fish that like warm water, fish that like cold water. You can have every different type of fish in that same area, and it brings them all together. And so it's an extremely good place for fishing. They also do forestry, so they cut down trees. There's some farming in the area, but like the Northeast states, it's not super good land. As well as tourism, because it's a beautiful area with the Appalachian Mountains and the ocean sitting right there. Okay, the next region is the interior plains, and the interior plains, their main thing, and it's good because it rhymes and it even rhymes with plains, is grains and trains. So they have this amazing train system set up like our Transcontinental Railroad here. Okay, but it is this amazing train system set up, and the whole point of it is to move grains, to move the things that they grow, the grasses like wheat, oats, barley, corn, things like that, from one area of the country out to the sides. And the sides are where they can send them on ships to other countries and make money off of them. Okay, and so the interior plains is all about grains and trains. And last but not least, the Canadian Cordilleras are the mountains, if you remember, and there is a lot of mining. There are some minerals and precious metals in the Cordilleras. They're kind of tough to get to, but another really good use for them is tourism. A lot of people go to the Canadian Cordilleras to the ski resorts because they have these really big mountains that have snow on them almost year round, and the people can go there to ski. So the environmental issues of Canada are some that we see in the United States, and they're going to have a lot in common with the ones we talked about with the United States, but one of them is kind of, just a Canada problem. Okay, and so the first three are similar to the United States, but the first one is people just all around the world, we take too much. We're asking too much of this world. We're asking it to support us in a way that it can't sustain. It can't stay the same way that it is. And so some of the things that they do in Canada in particular, there's too many dams, and what dams do is if you stop a river, it stops the natural flow, and so it can kill wildlife and it can destroy their habitat. Where they lived in this part of the river before, now this part of the river isn't a river anymore, it's a reservoir, it's a big lake that was made, or this part of the river has become narrower, has less water in it, so it supports less population of fish or whatever else lives there. Okay, and then also digging the holes to get the minerals obviously is damaging to the earth because you're taking away from the earth, as well as deforestation as you're eliminating the trees. Okay, The second environmental issue is air pollution. And air pollution is something they're working on with the United States, working on together. And they have put together a plan called the Border Air Quality Strategy in 2003. And it's a plan to completely or try and reduce pollution right around that border. Because there's a lot of cities that are north, far enough north, especially on that Great Lakes region from the US, that they're adding to that pollution, as well as the southern Canadian cities, which is where most of the Canadian cities are. And so there is a strategy put in place to try and take care of that air pollution, but also global warming. Global warming is a problem everywhere in the world. Okay, and global warming, a really, really good example of it, I tried to put a picture of it right here, is those greenhouse gases. Okay, the fossil fuels increase our greenhouse gases. So as we're using coal and as we're using gasoline and diesel and all of these things, they're increasing the amount of carbon in our atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas. And so we have to have greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. The sun comes in, as you can see, these yellow sun comes in, and then if we didn't have the greenhouse gases, then this red part is, they would just be sent right back out. So the heat from the sun, the solar radiation, would just leave the atmosphere right away, and it would be freezing here and we would die. We wouldn't be able to survive here. Okay, so we need some greenhouse gases, but as we're getting too many greenhouse gases which hold that heat from the sun, what it's causing is for our overall temperatures to go up just a little bit at a time, and they just keep going up and up and up and up and up, and eventually it's going to have some big problems, and some of them maybe have already started. And what's going to happen is it's going to increase the strength and severity of our storms. As they come through, they're going to get stronger and stronger and stronger, as well as melt the polar ice caps. And if it melts the polar ice caps, if it melts all the ice on the earth, then it's going to flood coastal cities all around the earth. Okay, and so Canada did work together to make a plan in 1997. However, the problem is one country can't do this alone. We need all of the countries to make a plan to reduce greenhouse gases if we're ever going to stop this problem from happening and threatening human life on Earth and the Earth itself. Okay. Now the last one, which is just a Canada problem. Well, it's not just a Canada problem, but Canada is one of the few countries that has to deal with it because they have big Arctic areas. Is these cold areas, these frozen areas, are really fragile. If you make a mistake, if you spill oil way up north in the frozen areas, there's less living things around to clean it up. So there's less algae and different things that can take care of it, and it doesn't move out as quickly because it's in frozen water or cold, slow-moving water, as opposed to fast-moving water connected to all the oceans. And so it doesn't have this movement through the systems that clean it up really quick, like in the Gulf of Mexico when they had the oil spill. Now we don't even hear about it. Most of it has been cleaned up and a lot of it has been done naturally. Okay, but if it happened up in the Arctic areas, if something like that happened, it would take a very long time before it would be cleaned up naturally. And so it's very fragile, and small mistakes or big mistakes that you make in the Arctic take a very long time to fix.